Today we are going to be covering REACH tips, and more specifically, we're going to talk about resources generated. So in case you guys haven't came to any of our other webinars so far this year, we have kind of been taking it back to basics this year and covering our different output types that you might see in REACH. So we have so far talked about things from community actions to community changes. And today we're going to get into resources generated. And mainly because resources generated is quite a large part of tracking your coalition's data. And I want to make sure that you guys have, some good basic knowledge, as well as some good tips, tricks that might be helpful for you along the way. So in terms of kind of our agenda for today, that's going to be exactly what we're doing. We're going to talk about what are resources generated, making sure to really dig into each of those three different types that we specifically track in REACH. And then we're going to get into some tips, helpful documents, things like that for you guys. And we're going to wrap up with letting you guys ask any questions, comments you might have for us. If you have any questions as we go through, feel free to pop them in the chat as well, and we'll make sure to kind of dig through those. If not, we'll make sure to have time at the end for those too. So let's get into this. Let's get into what is resources generated, or what do we mean by resources generated, right? So in REACH, resources generated basically comes down to, in simple terms, the acquisition of funding, whether that be through grants, donations, in-kind, volunteer time, to help fund and support the organization's projects, initiatives, and work. Kind of a wordy description, if you ask me. In my mind, at the end of the day, if anyone was to ask me what is resources generated, I like to say basically anything that has value tied to it that relates back to the coalition. So that could be things from cash donations, grants, things like in-kind donations, supplies being donated, discounts on space, discounts on supplies. There's tons of different things that we have coming in as an organization, right? We're a nonprofit, we get a lot of things at a free or reduced rate. We might go for different grants. At any given time, there's just a lot going on in terms of the realm of money or things that cost money that our coalition has and is generating. So keep in mind today, as we go through kind of these different resource types and are talking about resources generated, that these can be very dependent on your organization and how it runs. Some organizations have a lot of in-kind that comes in naturally. Maybe it's space that's donated. Maybe it's, time for a staff member's PTO. There might just be a lot of different things that come into play naturally for your organization that we never want to forget about. We also need to understand that a different organization might not have those same resources that they have coming in, and they might have to take a little bit of a different approach to generate some of those resources or to track them. So keep in mind, no organization is the same. No one tracks their resources the same. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to what is our coalition, saving and spending money on? Where is that cash flow going and coming from? So let's get into the three types that we break it up to in REACH. Because like I said, resources generated is really anything that has a value tied to it. And at the end of the day, that's basically everything, right? We all know that people's time is worth value, supplies, space, every little thing on this world has a value tied to it in some way, shape, or form. So to make things easier in terms of tracking and for reporting out for grants, we have found that breaking it up into these three main resource types will make it a lot easier for you guys to track your data and just keep track of where the cash is coming from and going, right? So the first one we're going to have is straight up cash. So think of this as exactly like it's pictured here, our cold hard green money in our hand, right? These are usually things from cash donations, so kind of your free flowing money that we can spend kind of however we want, all the way down to things like grant funding or other organizations that might donate to us, other businesses that might donate us some money. But it's basically cash in our bank account. We can see it, we can spend it. Some of it might have regulations on how we spend it, but at the end of the day, cash is going to come down to that green cold hard money I can hold or write a check in my hand. Now, when it comes to thinking through some examples for reach, I wanted to make sure we talked about a couple of different things. And the first one being here, just kind of how to write out our example description for a cash entry. So if we're looking at recording a cash entry, or in this case, a cash donation, we might type something up like this. The coalition received a cash donation of $300 from Y&Z Supplies to purchase electronic identification scanners for checking IDs. Really simple description. It's really clear what the resource amount was, or in this case, the cash amount, which was $300. Who it came from can be really important when it comes to writing your resources generated entries as well. So in this case, we can clearly see that Y&Z Supplies donated us this money. And in this case, they stipulated what they wanted us to use it for, and they wanted us to use it to purchase electronic identification scanners for ID checking. So this is definitely a good example of some type of entry we might have for cash that you could be recording. Also keep in mind, it could be something like grant funding. Some of our clients like to track how they spend their grant funding, and that can definitely be done in Reach. We recommend to do it that way, to do it how you spend it. So sometimes that might be as simple as saying, you know, the past quarter we spent $1,000 to have space for our coalition events and meetings. You know, it might be something in Reach as easy as that. It might be something a little bit more confusing, or I shouldn't say confusing, but more intricate, like, oh, we spent this much money on supplies for this specific event. At the end of the day, it's going to help you guys determine how you're spending your money better, where money's going, and where it's coming from. So definitely keep that in mind. And again, every coalition is different. Another example we have on here is a local couple. So here we have Bill and Amy Smith donated $200 to the coalition to buy supplies for their upcoming youth summit. Again, we can see what that amount of cash was. We have $200 here. Who donated it, which is Bill and Amy Smith. And then we have what we're going to be using it for supplies for our upcoming youth summit. If they didn't stipulate how they wanted us to use that money, that's okay. I always say it's best to think through what kind of events we have coming up, maybe what type of things we need to buy for an event or for a meeting, and really then kind of link that to maybe a donation we received. And it's always good to keep track of people's names. If they are okay with giving you their names when they donate, that's great, because we can send thank you cards. We can, you know, have recognition events at the end of the year for people who donated so much money throughout the year. If they want to remain anonymous, we know that that's okay too. That's definitely trackable in Reach. It's really dependent on who's donating and how they want to do that. So definitely two different types of cash here that we can have. And of course, there's tons of different other options we could have depending on our coalition, our community, and what kind of cash we're seeing come through. So and I love that you brought this up, because it's a great segue into the in-kind piece. And I know we've kind of been talking about it per Jackie's questions. But in-kind really is anything from supplies, space, and things that you guys might get at that free or reduced rate, like professional time in this case that Jackie brought up. I think this is so great that you brought up this example, Jackie, because when people think of in-kind, they tend to think, oh, you know, we got free meeting space, that's in-kind. Or, hey, we didn't have to pay for these supplies, someone donated them to us, that's in-kind. Which are really the two bigger in-kinds that we tend to see. But the last one is time, and that comes down to professional time. Meaning, if someone is acting in their professional capacity, doing their job, so to speak, and they would normally charge a going rate for that, or I like to say are getting paid for it, but you're not paying them, we want to make sure that we track them at that professional rate, which becomes in-kind. So for instance, you might see a prescription drug take-back event is my favorite example, because a lot of times at events like that, we might have to have a security officer, a police officer, just for security purposes. We're taking a lot of prescription drugs that people are dropping off. It can be really dangerous. You know, we don't want to put ourselves in that dangerous situation. So we maybe have a police officer standing there with us, they're at the event in uniform, they're on the job, he, she, they might be there getting paid, but we're not having to pay them, right? We're not taking money out of the coalition's funds to say, hey, here's your salary for coming and working at our event. And that is where that in-kind for time comes in, because that officer might be making, maybe he's making $40 an hour, and our volunteer rate might only be $25, $29. What is better, right? The $40 that he's making or the $29 volunteer rate? The $40, right? So we want to make sure that we're respecting his time and tracking him at that professional rate. A, it helps us get our in-kind up and our resources that we need. B, it's respectful. We're tracking him at his professional rate as he's there providing us his professional service. I did have a couple other examples here. Again, one is very space related. So the village donated space for the coalition to use as their offices for the month of May. The other one is a local restaurant donated food for our coalition training event valued at $300. So again, these are both kind of discounted or free items that the coalition received. We don't quite see this $600 in cash, but it's money that we're not having to spend, right? It's not money that we're seeing go out or really come in at all. It's money that we're saving. So my favorite tip, my favorite, keep in mind question when you're ever tracking in-kind is to ask yourself, what are we saving? And you can do this with any event that the coalition hosts, any meeting, any activity really. Is just ask ourselves, hey, I just went and met with so-and-so. Did I have to pay for space? Did I have to pay for food? Did I have to pay for supplies for this? If I didn't, then we're saving money, right? If those things were there, but I didn't have to pay for them, we're saving money, and we want to track that. Awesome. Okay, so let's move on to volunteer time. Our last resource type is volunteer time. And I like saving this one for last because it's basically our people time outside of those in-kind, right? So sometimes it might get a little tricky trying to decide, well, are they providing me a professional service or are they just volunteering for me, right? And keep in mind, it comes down to that question of, are they on the clock? Are they acting within their professional sphere of influence? Those are the two biggest things to keep in mind when you're trying to decide to track them at their professional rate or the volunteer rate. The first one is to ask yourself, are they on the clock? So in the case of the police officer, he was on the clock, he was in uniform, he was getting paid by the police station, whatever, but we weren't paying him, right? So that's textbook in-kind, textbook professional service. In Jackie's case with the photographer, he might not have been getting paid to be there. He might not have been exactly on the clock, but he was acting within his professional sphere of influence and would usually charge for those services. So you would definitely track him at that in-kind as well. On the flip side of that, on the volunteer end, this is where people are really just there to give us their time and energy that are not on the clock. They're really just there to help out the coalition, right? So it could be something such as, Donnie Unicorn volunteered to meet with the city council on behalf of the coalition to discuss the potential of a social host ordinance adoption. Meeting might have lasted 1 hour. So if Donnie, our number one coalition member, said, hey, I am totally willing to go down to the city council and talk on behalf of the coalition. I think I have a lot to say. I want to talk about this. That's great. He's not acting in the capacity of his job. He just is a very involved coalition member and wants to help us out, right? He wants to come down and be an active voice of the community. So he went ahead and did that, and the meeting lasted 1 hour, and we can track him at that volunteer rate. And then, of course, one of the most popular things that comes up when it comes to volunteer time is your meetings. So in this case, this coalition held an opioid committee meeting, 12 people attended, and the meeting lasted 1 hour. So everyone there was just there, on their own time, coming to our meeting to help us out, volunteering. So we're going to track them at that volunteer rate. Keep in mind the current volunteer value, volunteer rate, the national average is $29.95, so $29.95. Hopefully, you know, if your state rate is higher, you should be using that state rate. I know Jackie, I know your guys's is. Down in Maryland, I am not 100% sure on the rest of the attendees in today, but you guys should know if your state rate is higher. I know like New York, New Jersey's, a lot of those places on the East Coast or the West Coast tend to be higher. But if you are one of those people that are kind of in the middle, you're probably using that national rate of $29.95 for your volunteer time. And that's totally okay. That's usable for adults, for youth, for anyone that's there volunteering their time. So definitely. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through and I want to keep us moving so we don't take up too much time today. Let's get into some quick tips and just kind of some helpful things that you guys might see to help you in terms of your resources generated tracking. So let's talk about determining value in time. We have talked about this a little bit, but kind of knowing in-kind value in time and knowing where that professional time lies. So value. When it comes to determining in-kind value, let's talk there first. Always ask yourself, what is the coalition saving? I cannot say this enough. This is one of the biggest questions or tips I have for you, is to always ask yourself that. Because as a coalition, as a nonprofit organization, you guys are usually always saving money somewhere. Whether it's, you know, not having to pay for gas, you know, maybe it is having your home office and the coalition doesn't reimburse you for it, you know, that's money that the coalition's saving. They're not having to pay your electric bill or your Wi-Fi bill at home, maybe because you're working from home. There's different little small things that are there dependent on your coalition and your organization's functioning and the way you guys do things. So definitely don't ever be afraid to ask yourself this question of what are we saving? And that will become our value that we want to track. Professional time, we've talked about this quite a bit, so I'm not going to get too much more into it today, but really just take the time that was provided and multiply that by the average hourly wage of that person that was providing that service. So in the case of the police officer, you know, we might not know exactly what his hourly rate is. That's okay. We don't want to make you guys feel like you have to be in that awkward situation of asking, hey, how much do you make? Sorry, this is a really personal question, but I just need to know how much you make for my in-kind. If you guys feel like you have that relationship built up with that person or with an organization that maybe sends you guys a lot of professional time workers, I always say it can't hurt to ask. The most they can say is, you know, I prefer not to say, which is totally fine, respectful, right? You're allowed to ask, but they're allowed to decline. But at the end of the day, it's okay to do small Google searches to try and find an average or an honest hourly wage for something like a local sheriff, a local police officer with 5 years experience. You know, it's okay to do a small Google search on that and use what you find for the time being. Of course, hopefully you develop that relationship and you feel at some point comfortable asking that question of how much their time is worth. We have also asked or had clients that have used a anonymous survey that they send out every year to their coalition members or people that just tend to help them a lot for their average hourly wage. So it's, you know, it's anonymous. No one knows who's saying that's how much they make, but it helps give them kind of that rate for the year to help track for some of those professional services they might get and use on an ongoing basis. And then the last kind of part of determining value or time is volunteer time. And I think everyone's pretty good at this, but time can be rounded to the nearest quarter hour. We recommend doing this. It makes the math easier on your guys' end because we do use that decimal time in Reach. We do have a chart. I did not include it below, but there is a chart that is in our Reach manual. And if that is something that you just want the chart to be able to print out, we do have a time conversion chart from decimal per minute. So if that is something you guys are interested in, I can always make sure that is sent out as well to the attendees today. And then we also have organizations should use the national volunteer rate as their volunteer value. And obviously using your state rate where permitted, where it's higher, right? And then lastly, anytime you need to find that up-to-date volunteer, you know, rate, it is on independent sector.org. volunteer time, volunteers underscore value, something like that. It tends to change per year. We are usually really good at sending that out to you guys when it does change. So just make sure that you keep an eye out for that, usually in the spring. All right, Jackie said, let's see here. Just checking, what is the most up-to-date REACH manual? I have the 2020. Yes, that is the most up-to-date REACH manual, Jackie. We are actually working on updating a couple things in it this year. Nothing super crazy, just kind of getting some new examples and adding some new graphics to it. So you might be getting one by the end of this year, but yes, the 2021 is our most recent. Let's get on to our next tip, which is tracking grants and funding. We talked about this a little bit. Coalitions do this differently depending on if you guys have a treasurer or some type of accounting system already in place. So some of you, this might be completely irrelevant, but grant money can be recorded as a resource generated in REACH, typically as cash, and we typically recommend recording it in REACH as you use it, which can be a little tricky, right? If you already have an accounting system that works, do not feel like you need to do this. We also have other coalitions that say, hey, we keep track of all of our grant funding and how we spend it on an Excel sheet, like our treasurer does it. We just want to use REACH to track our match and to track all of our in-kind volunteer time that's coming in, which is totally fine. Either way your coalition does it is right for whatever your coalition needs to do. So, but there is a way to track your grant funding in REACH if you don't have that really great treasurer or that accounting system. We just recommend tracking those grant funds as they're being used. So for instance, down here, the coalition dispersed 10,000 of its DFC communities money for the month of August for the month's activities focused mostly on underage drinking. That is what one coalition recorded. And that's fine. That's at least simple enough to where you know where your money is going and being spent on or towards, and for what month, the month of August. We recommend if you're going to do it that way, do it monthly, at least. Some of our clients like to do it quarterly. It just depends on if that's what you're going to use that for. Whatever way works best for you guys in terms of what you need to come out of it, right? Some of our clients like to go this route down here, which just says the coalition received a $100,000 SPF grant to address binge drinking. This is okay too. Again, though, it's not really saying what you're using this money for, just that you guys got it. So it's good, but we definitely recommend going more of the other route of kind of saying how you're using it, what it's going towards, and really recording it in REACH as you spend it. And then the last tip we wanted to talk about was actually this new handout that we just created. It's going to be coming out here in the next couple weeks, so keep an eye out for it. It's called the Non-Federal Match Tracking Sheet. And it's basically just full of ideas and tips to help you guys kind of meet that non-federal match component that a lot of our clients on DFC have to have, right? So we have had some of our staff here that have been coalition coordinators, coalition directors, put together this handout for you guys to really help you meet that match component and think outside the box of your normal space supplies, right? So that should be coming out soon, and you guys will have that in our newsletter. So keep an eye out. All right, I'm not seeing anything come through, so if you are still typing, feel free to keep going. I'm just going to finish up, kind of wrapping us up for the day. I will say thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Jackie, and Janine. You guys have all been great today, asking good questions. I think that have helped your fellow attendees. So those were great questions you guys have asked today. We want to just wrap up today with saying, if you have not registered, our upcoming ECS client retreat in the fall is quickly approaching capacity. We have less than 15 spots left. So if you are planning on going, or your coalition is planning on sending people, make sure you guys get registered sooner than later. The registration fee doesn't have to be paid until August. So definitely make sure, if you're at least thinking about coming, to get yourself on that list or get your coalition on that list. We are allowing 2 registrants per client right now. So if you have not, or your coalition hasn't already registered for those 2 spots, make sure you are doing that. I'm going to go ahead and post that link in there in case anyone wants to check out the ECS website. It has a little bit more information about our event in terms of registration, where it's at, when things are happening. So if you want to do that, feel free. Our next webinar, and this is actually going to be our last scheduled webinar for the year. We have focused on REACH tips all year in terms of our webinars. And our last one is going to be in July on the 13th. And we're going to focus on key events. So we're going to kind of steer away from the accomplishment output side of the world. And we're going to talk about key events, which a lot of times tend to fall by the wayside for a lot of our coalitions and a lot of our clients. We just tend to forget about them, right? We tend to forget that they're there. We tend to forget to record them. And that's everyone. I'm going to tell you guys, no, we're not singling out anyone here. That happens to everyone. So we're going to kind of talk about those, really dig into some examples, things to keep a lookout for, and even some tips to help you guys hopefully get better at tracking those key events. And again, that's July 13th, again at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. With that, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you guys learned something and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.